Welcome to everyone to today's roundtable. The theme, what we're going to discuss today, is a global perspective on the challenges of heat pump deployment.
The heat pump market is split into various segments, right? So the biggest one is the domestic hot water segment. We have as Steve said, the air-to-air, air-to-water, and the part that I get involved with mostly is the larger commercial buildings, that today use gas boilers and need to move to heat pump technology. So, each part of the industry has its own challenges in moving from burning fossil fuels to renewable heating. Right? I think in terms of the technologies, we are seeing a shift. I think the industry is learning, particularly around the new refrigerants. So, we're seeing now a lot more application of the new HFOs, and some of them give capability for us to be able to produce hot water temperatures. And so in the previous iteration of equipment, we would have R134A, for example, with a heat pump that could produce maybe 65-degree hot water. But today with 1234ZE, you can produce 80-degree hot water with the same equipment, right? So the new refrigerants bring new opportunities. The other area that we're seeing some development now is moving into low-pressure refrigerants, historically used in large chillers, but again, because of their low pressure characteristics, can enable us to produce high temperature hot water, right? More for industrial type applications above 80 degrees C. So there's a lot of work going on in that space. I think in the area of smaller refrigerant charges, we're seeing a move to what people refer to as the natural refrigerants, the hydrocarbons, the propane, isobutane, these type of refrigerants. And I think, we're seeing a lot of movement, particularly in the domestic and residential space for those refrigerants.
Yeah.
And I think it's good as an industry, we're starting with systems that have a relatively small refrigerant charge. And then as we get more experience with those, we can increase the charge size and, apply it to larger pieces of equipment. But so to me, the technology, the compressor technologies are pretty similar, but the way that we apply them to these new refrigerants is the evolving area that we're seeing that is bringing new opportunities in the area of heating.
We're very similar to the US. I think our market's about 1.1 million hot water heaters in total, 50% gas, 50% electric. And interestingly, the new homes are still doing gas and electric because the incentive was all based on replacement. So where's the technology going? I think unless we get a shift in the new home market, we're going to be stagnant.
The technology, again, isn't new. It's just being applied in newer areas at much larger scale. And I think the biggest issue, and we have very similar to what Mark was saying in the U.S., most replacements today still are, gas or electric resistance are being replaced by the heat pumps just because of the cost of electricity. It's much more efficient if you're using electricity to use a heat pump-based technology. But for gas in the U.S., that cost of energy is, in some cases, a quarter to a third less, a third of what it costs for electric generation. So even though you're very efficient on heat pumps and electricity, the cost of electricity to run it is still so much greater than gas. And so therefore, again, trying to get the market to say, hey, this makes sense, not only for the first cost, but also the operating costs through the life of the product.
I think listening to all three of you, I'm sort of thinking, well, we have the same problems in Europe.
What a surprise.
But ours is much more accentuated through legislation. At the moment, you may or may not have heard of, we've had a third piece of legislation called the F-gas regulation, which is actually banning the use of all HFCs, F-gases, between basically now and 2035. So what are we left with? Well, we're perhaps left with very low GWP gases, so the HFOs. But we've got another piece of legislation called PFAS that is aiming to actually ban PFAS or HFOs. We've got a couple of HFOs that probably will sneak through that are low GWP and not a PFAS. So if you're looking at to your question, the market today is clearly hydrocarbons. We don't like calling them natural refrigerants, because they're not really. But anyway, for the sake of it. So the word on the street is propane, propane, propane. However, apart from, I think, the safety issues, our building codes in Europe wouldn't accept propane. So if you go to Paris in big building blocks, they'll look at you as if you're crazy if you come along with your propane. So actually the real answer, we don't have it in Europe, and that's the problem. And to I think what you were saying is there's a ready market there, and we saw it, for example, at Mostra Convegno, which is a big trade fair in Milan 2 months ago. All the Chinese in Europe, they had the biggest stands, all with their propane monoblocks, which is great because you can stick that outside of a house, and it's safe, it's low charge. But then what? So we're really at a crossroads where the manufacturers themselves, well, what do I produce? What do I produce for the next 5-10 years? And at the same time, the other side of the coin, there's other legislation policy saying, try and get these heat pumps out as quickly as possible. So we are competing with the gas boiler manufacturers, and they are, I guess, trying to corner the market until the perfect heat pump solution's out there. So there's heat pumps and there's still gas boilers. There is talk of banning gas boilers now, whether that's a good thing or another thing. If you are in Slovakia or Poland, you don't want to really ban one of those things, because then they'll turn to what? And that's the other key thing, is the price, unfortunately, of heat pumps in Europe is massive. And then to Steve's point, gas between electricity, we're at least, a third more. So huge challenges at a time when we're supposed to be decarbonising rather quickly.
Now we're going to move on to quality control. We're going to talk about standards, energy efficiency, and the different markets, and maybe a little bit about how you're managing quality in your markets.
The issue that we have, and I'm not sure about Europe or the US, is we have a standard, but we don't have a good compliance regime. So, the ability to check test is almost zero. You've got products that have resistant coils in them and pretending to be heat pumps, and the resistant coil actually does most of the heavy lifting. So we've got some real challenges in the market in terms of compliance, testing regimes, and making sure that the standards that we're looking at actually reflect good consumer outcomes. And I'm sure you guys have exactly the same issues. And then there's another piece around training. It's, the consumer needs to be trained, the plumbers need to be trained. We're sort of trying to blend the refrigeration trade to the plumbing trade, which has never gone well. They just hate each other, unfortunately. Probably can't quote that bit, but anyway.
I think it's pretty well known.
Yeah.
I don't think it's anything new.
We've got some massive challenges ahead.
From a European perspective, we were talking earlier on what's a heat pump. I think the Joe in the street, the average punter doesn't actually know what is a heat pump. So he or she still focus on the gas boiler, and when they do compare gas boiler to a heat pump, I mean, you're talking £3,000 or euros for a gas boiler, everything included. And to quote somebody who's a manufacturer of heat pumps, he spent 30,000 euros on his heat pump. Okay, that's maybe the extreme, but people are just going to say, I can't afford it. Secondly, is what we're very worried in Europe is that whether it's poor manufacturing or poor products or use of flammables and it's not properly controlled, that a few of these start to blow up, because that will perhaps kill the heat pump market. And, you know, we're going down to electrification and decarbonizing. So we're really stretched here. I think the other aspect we touched upon is energy efficiency. If you're talking HFCs, they've got very high energy efficiency, and we've actually got implemented in law the energy efficiency first principle. But even that's being sort of wavered or not being really implemented properly to be able to bring in the hydrocarbons in. Now there's a debate, is propane less energy efficiency? I haven't got to the bottom of that one, but there are many different views. And then to come back to your point, Mark, is training and certification. I would say, it's not to exaggerate, that most are not trained or certified, and under EU law there will be mandatory certification of HFCs plus HFOs plus propane or CO2 or ammonia. And that's, I think, the critical thing. We won't have enough people to get good equipment in. And then lastly, to your point, yes, we are very concerned about the market being flooded because they hear there's money to be made. So are there good products coming from X, Y, and Z? And that's a great concern. Coming back to my first story is, you know, if a couple of these blow up, it hurts the whole marketplace.
We need to take steps to, educate the market as well as the contractors. The role of incentives are good, but they do cause market distortions and false markets. An example, in the United States, AHRI has its certification program that's a voluntary industry program. We don't rely on government for enforcement. The industry has stepped in and self-regulates. But we also, as part of that, do the reporting for all of our participants to the U.S. Department of Energy, the EPA, and the different regulatory authorities. 2002, we passed the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which created huge tax incentives for heat pumps and other technology. 2002, we submitted just under 3,000 products, models that met the tax credits. 2003, that went up to almost 2 million. Not all products, be they from domestic manufacturers or foreign manufacturers, some are good, some are bad. Everybody will play the game because capitalism is such that people are going to say what they need to say to do it. But I think one of the things we need to tell consumers as well as contractors, it's something I learned from my parents. If it sounds too good to be true, it usually is too good.
Yep.
And if you only have to pay, $100, or a very small amount to get a heat pump in, you're probably going to get what you paid for.
Yeah.
One of the solutions, you can have government step in, and I think the EU in some ways, with their regulations and mandates and other things but mandates without enforcement isn't a solution. Yeah. And so what we did in the U.S., and this was way before my time, I mean, we've been doing it for over 50 years, is industry decided that they were going to self-regulate. So they, worked through and voluntarily said, we can't rely upon the government, we can't rely upon others, let's do it ourselves. And so, one of the solutions is the industry working, having standards, selecting a standard is the first thing. You have to determine how you want to measure the products so everybody can have a fair game, but then setting up some type of compliance or verification system that the industry does on its own. Really a solution is the industry has to decide, do they want to have a fair market and open competition, or rely on government.
If you look at the air conditioning market, we've got a really good program in place,
Right.
the energy efficiency star rating system, and
Right.
there's good compliance. It was a industry-driven initiative, hand in hand with government, and it works really, really well. And it's had, what have we had? Something like 60% improvement in energy efficiency in the last 10 years in equipment.
Right.
So it works. I think the challenge with the domestic hot water heating is trying to compare 3 different types of technology that delivers the same outcome. So you've got
Yeah.
gas, electric and heat pump.
Yeah.
How do you compare those 3 products, and how do you put in a star rating system? So to answer your question, Sandra, what's the answer? Well, hopefully the reason we're here over the next week is to come up with some of those answers collectively.
In Europe, whether we like it or not, we're being led by governments, by the EU, setting rules in place. And you're right, it's the compliance. So if you just take the European Union, we've got rules, whether they're good or not, that's not the issue, but it's the compliance. And the member states just don't have the manpower or the know-how. And I think going back to your original question, what do we do? And I think in Europe we do have a set of rules called eco-design, which is really looking at trying to set up standards, rules for the best possible equipment. So we have faith in that. But sometimes they're pushing us so far that, can we get there? And I think this is where we feel the decision makers are still not very realistic. So our problem in Europe is we're happy to go down that route, but give us time for adaptation. There are subsidy schemes across Europe, but it feels like it's a yo-yo. Country comes up with 100% and then suddenly it disappears because there's a new government in and they have a different policy. And when it's to do with environmental law, an individual country can actually go further than what the European Union law does. So you can have a country saying, no, in our country we go even further. So a manufacturer constructs according to X law and then realizes actually it doesn't quite fit the new law of the other country. So I think we've got a very long way to go. But we still hopefully glass half full.